My uncle left me a quarter-acre patch of dirt nobody in the family ever cared about. I almost signed it away without even looking at it first. Then I found out it was the exact piece of land an entire HOA had been trying to buy for 11 years. By the time I was done, the board that once ignored my uncle's calls was sitting across the table, begging me for a deal on my terms. If you love watching entitled HOAs finally meet someone who won't just hand over what they want, subscribe now, because this story ends with a community forced to face a decision they spent over a decade avoiding. My Uncle Walt was the kind of man who collected odd little parcels of land the way other people collect stamps. Small, forgotten lots, tax-delinquent corners, strange leftover slivers created by old surveying mistakes decades ago. Most of it was worthless. He just liked owning pieces of the world nobody else wanted. When he passed away, I inherited a folder full of deeds for properties I'd genuinely never heard of. Most were exactly what I expected, tiny useless strips of land scattered across 3 counties, barely worth the property taxes owed on them. One deed, though, caught my attention simply because of a sticky note attached to it in my uncle's handwriting. Just 3 words. Don't sell this one. I looked up the parcel out of curiosity more than anything else. A quarter-acre lot, oddly shaped, sitting directly in the middle of what was now a sprawling HOA community called Fairview Commons. Not on the edge, not tucked into some forgotten corner, directly in the center. I drove out to see it, mostly expecting an empty patch of weeds surrounded by fencing. Instead, I found something that made me stop my car in the middle of the street and just stare. The parcel sat squarely in the middle of what was clearly meant to be the community's central park and clubhouse area, the exact spot where sidewalks converged, where landscaping had been carefully designed around something, and where, oddly, absolutely nothing had been built. Just my uncle's quarter-acre, fenced off, untouched, sitting like a missing puzzle piece in the middle of an otherwise fully developed neighborhood. I called a friend who worked in local real estate, describing what I'd found. She went quiet for a moment before responding. "Wait," she said, "Fairview Commons? The one that's been trying to finish their community clubhouse for like a decade? I don't know anything about that." "Why?" "That neighborhood's been stuck in some kind of legal limbo for years," she said. "I remember hearing about it because a client of mine almost bought a lot there, then backed out when he found out the clubhouse project kept getting delayed. Something about a landowner who refused to sell a key parcel." I sat with that information, slowly putting together exactly what my uncle's sticky note might have actually meant. I pulled county records that same evening, and everything clicked into place almost immediately. Fairview Commons had begun development 12 years earlier, with detailed plans showing a community clubhouse, pool, and central gathering space, all designed around a parcel of land the developer had somehow failed to acquire before construction began. My uncle's parcel. According to old HOA meeting minutes I found archived online, the association had approached him multiple times over the years, offering increasingly higher amounts for the land, all of which he'd apparently declined without much explanation. Eventually, they'd simply built everything around it, leaving that awkward, fenced-off gap sitting in the middle of their community for over a decade, unable to complete the clubhouse project everyone had been promised when they bought their homes. I sat back, absorbing the full scope of what I'd actually just inherited. Not a random, worthless piece of dirt. The single missing piece an entire community had been waiting 11 years to finally get their hands on. I spent the next several days trying to understand exactly why my uncle had refused to sell for over a decade, especially given how persistently the HOA had apparently pursued him. I called a few of his old friends, people who'd known him well enough that they might remember something relevant. One of them, a retired contractor named Bill, who'd worked with my uncle on various property deals over the years, remembered the situation clearly. "Walt told me about that parcel a few times," Bill said the developer originally promised him a fair price before construction started, then tried lowballing him significantly once they realized how badly they needed it. He got stubborn after that, told me he'd rather let the land sit empty forever than reward someone for trying to take advantage of him. That detail reframed everything for me. This wasn't simple stubbornness or an old man being difficult for no reason. My uncle had felt disrespected during those initial negotiations, and his response had been to simply refuse ever again, regardless of how much money they eventually offered. I pulled every piece of correspondence I could find in his files, and the pattern became increasingly clear. The developer's initial offer, made before construction began, had been reasonable, roughly matching fair market value for undeveloped land in the area at that time. But negotiations apparently stalled when my uncle requested additional time to consider the offer, and instead of respecting that request, the developer had moved forward with construction anyway, seemingly assuming he'd eventually cave once he saw the neighborhood built up around him. He never did. Instead, every subsequent offer, and there were several documented over the following decade, came with a noticeably lower amount than the original proposal, likely because the developer, and eventually the HOA that took over community management, assumed my uncle's leverage would weaken over time as he aged and presumably grew tired of the ongoing dispute. They'd misjudged him completely. I sat with all of this information, feeling something shift inside me that I hadn't quite expected. I hadn't inherited this situation looking for a fight, but understanding exactly how the community's leadership had treated my uncle over the years, first disrespecting him, then repeatedly lowballing him once they realized how much they actually needed what he had, changed how I felt about simply handing this opportunity away without a second thought. I contacted a real estate attorney, a sharp, experienced woman named Carolyn, who specialized specifically in situations involving development disputes and land use negotiations. "This is actually a fascinating situation," she said, after reviewing everything I'd gathered. "You're in an extremely strong negotiating position. They've spent over a decade unable to complete a project residents were promised when they purchased their homes. That kind of prolonged construction delay typically creates significant internal pressure within an HOA, especially if residents have been growing increasingly frustrated over the years. What kind of pressure are we talking about? Property value concerns, for one," Carolyn said. "An unfinished community amenity, especially one prominently advertised during initial sales, can affect resale values and overall resident satisfaction significantly. I'd guess there's considerable internal frustration directed at HOA leadership for failing to resolve this after all this time. I decided to do a bit more research before making any decisions about how to proceed, curious exactly how much internal frustration actually existed within Fairview Commons regarding this ongoing situation. I found an active neighborhood social media group, mostly public posts complaining about various community issues, and searched specifically for mentions of the clubhouse project. What I found confirmed exactly what Carolyn had suspected. Post after post, spanning years, expressing growing frustration and confusion about why the promised community clubhouse remained unfinished. Several residents specifically mentioned feeling misled during their initial home purchases, having been shown renderings and models depicting a fully completed community space that, over a decade later, still didn't exist. One particularly detailed post from a woman named Patricia, who'd apparently lived there since the neighborhood's earliest phase, laid out the situation in frustrated detail. "We were told this would be completed within 2 years of moving in. It's been over a decade. The board keeps saying it's complicated legal issues without ever explaining exactly what those issues actually are." I sat there reading through years of quiet resident frustration, understanding that most people in that community had absolutely no idea the actual reason behind their unfinished clubhouse was a single, quietly determined man who'd simply refused to be taken advantage of, followed now by his nephew, who was beginning to realize he held exactly the same leverage his uncle had carefully protected for over a decade. I decided it was finally time to reach out to Fairview Commons' current HOA board directly, curious exactly how they would respond to someone new holding the same leverage that had frustrated them for over 11 years. I sent a simple, professionally worded letter to Fairview Commons HOA board, informing them that I'd inherited the parcel following my uncle's passing and that I was open to discussing its future, without specifying exactly what that meant. The response came faster than I expected. Within 3 days, I received a call from someone identifying herself as the current HOA board president, a woman named Vanessa Cho, her tone carrying an unmistakable mixture of relief and urgency that told me immediately how significant this situation still remained for the community, even after 11 years of unresolved frustration. "We're so glad to hear from you," she said, practically talking over herself with enthusiasm. "We've been hoping to resolve this situation for years. I understand you inherited the parcel from your uncle?" "That's right," I said carefully. "We'd love to schedule a meeting as soon as possible," she continued. "We're prepared to discuss a fair purchase agreement, one that properly reflects current market value for the parcel." Something about her immediate eagerness, combined with everything I'd learned about the years of lowball offers made to my uncle, made me cautious about moving too quickly. "I appreciate that," I said. Before we discuss specific numbers, I'd like to understand the full history here. My uncle mentioned some difficulties with earlier negotiations. There was a brief pause on the line. I wasn't personally involved in those earlier discussions, Vanessa said carefully. I've only been board president for the past 2 years. But I understand there were some miscommunications early on. Miscommunications. That word felt carefully chosen, deliberately vague in a way that avoided directly acknowledging what my research had already made clear. The developer and later the HOA had repeatedly attempted to pressure my uncle into accepting less than fair value, assuming his resolve would eventually weaken. I scheduled a meeting for the following week, giving myself time to consult further with Carolyn about exactly how to approach negotiations given everything I now understood about the situation's actual history. You have significant leverage here, Carolyn reminded me during our preparation call. 11 years of unfinished construction, ongoing resident frustration, and a documented history of the association's own leadership repeatedly attempting to lowball a landowner who simply wanted fair treatment. That's not just a strong negotiating position. That's potentially a public relations problem for them if this becomes widely known throughout the community. I walked into that meeting with the HOA board a week later, feeling more prepared and clear-headed than I genuinely expected going into a conversation that just a few weeks earlier I would have handled completely differently, likely accepting whatever initial offer they presented without much thought. Vanessa greeted me warmly, alongside 2 other board members, in a small conference room clearly set up specifically for this discussion. Coffee, printed documents, the kind of careful professional presentation that told me they'd been anticipating this meeting for some time, likely hoping for a quick, straightforward resolution. We're prepared to offer $300,000 for the parcel, Vanessa said, sliding a printed proposal across the table. We believe this represents fair current market value. Given the property's unique position within our development, I reviewed the number carefully, comparing it against research Carolyn and I had done regarding comparable land values in the area, along with understanding the property's actual strategic importance to their stalled project. I appreciate the offer, I said, but I've done some research into this parcel's history, along with understanding exactly how central it is to completing your community clubhouse project. I don't think this figure accurately reflects its actual value to Fairview Commons specifically. Vanessa's expression shifted slightly, professional composure remaining intact, but something flickering behind her eyes that told me she hadn't expected significant pushback this early into negotiations. What figure would you consider appropriate? She asked carefully. I named a number nearly double their initial offer, based on Carolyn's assessment of the property's genuine strategic value. Factoring in 11 years of stalled construction costs, ongoing resident dissatisfaction, and the simple reality that Fairview Commons had no other option for completing a project residents had been promised over a decade earlier. The room went noticeably quiet. One of the other board members, an older man who'd remained silent until this point, finally spoke up, his tone carrying obvious frustration. That's an extremely aggressive number for essentially unusable land. It's not unusable to you, I said calmly. It's the exact opposite. It's the single most necessary piece of property your entire community has needed for over a decade, and based on my uncle's records, that fact was made very clear to your organization repeatedly, along with a pattern of trying to pressure him into accepting far less than fair value once you realized how badly you actually needed it. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, Vanessa glancing between her fellow board members, clearly recalculating her approach to this negotiation in real time. We'll need to discuss this further internally, she finally said, gathering the documents she'd brought. This isn't a number we can approve without full board consensus. As I left that meeting, I felt confident I'd finally shifted the leverage completely in my favor. What I didn't expect was the phone call I received later that same evening from a number I didn't recognize. You need to know something before this goes any further, an unfamiliar voice said. Vanessa isn't planning on negotiating fairly. I've seen what they're actually planning. I sat frozen for a moment, phone pressed to my ear, trying to process what the stranger was telling me. Who is this? My name's Robert, he said. I was on the HOA board for 6 years before stepping down last year. I know exactly how this association operates when it comes to that parcel, because I sat in on nearly every discussion about it during my time there. What exactly are you saying they're planning? Robert exhaled slowly. They're not going to negotiate in good faith. I've seen this pattern before with your uncle. They'll drag out discussions, make you feel like progress is happening, then eventually explore alternative options they think might pressure you into settling for less. What kind of alternative options? Eminent domain, he said, there's been discussion for years about petitioning the county to declare the parcel necessary for public community infrastructure, essentially forcing a sale at a court-determined value, likely far lower than what you're currently asking. My stomach tightened at that information. I called Carolyn immediately after hanging up with Robert, relaying everything he'd told me. Eminent domain typically applies to actual public infrastructure needs like roads or utilities, Carolyn explained. It's a significant legal stretch to apply it to a private HOA's community clubhouse project, but it's not entirely impossible, depending on how creatively their legal team frames the community benefit argument. Can they actually win that kind of case? It would be difficult, Carolyn said, but not impossible, especially if they can convince a judge the clubhouse serves genuine community welfare purposes beyond simple private recreational value. It's a real risk we should prepare for, regardless of how unlikely you consider it. I spent the following days working closely with Carolyn to develop a legal strategy that would protect my position regardless of whichever direction Fairview Commons ultimately decided to pursue. We documented everything thoroughly, my uncle's original fair negotiations, the developer's later attempts at pressuring him into lower offers, and the clear patterns suggesting this same treatment might now be directed toward me. 2 weeks passed without any formal response from Vanessa or the board following our initial meeting. Then, exactly as Robert had warned, I received a certified letter from the HOA's legal counsel formally notifying me of their intent to explore eminent domain proceedings through the county, citing essential community infrastructure development as their justification. I wasn't entirely surprised, given Robert's warning, but seeing it formally documented still sent a wave of genuine anxiety through me. Carolyn, however, remained calm when I called her with the news. This actually works significantly in our favor, she said. Eminent domain proceedings require extensive public documentation and justification. If they pursue this route, we'll have full legal access to every internal document related to their reasoning, their original negotiations with your uncle, and their entire history regarding this parcel. How does that help us exactly? Because that documentation will almost certainly reveal the same pattern of bad faith negotiation Robert described, Carolyn said. If we can demonstrate a clear pattern of intentionally lowballing a landowner, followed by an attempt to force an even lower court-determined value through eminent domain, that becomes a powerful public relations and potentially legal problem for them, especially once residents become aware of exactly how their own board has been handling this situation for over a decade. We decided our best strategy involved being proactive rather than simply waiting for their eminent domain proceedings to formally begin. Carolyn helped me draft a detailed public letter, addressed directly to Fairview Commons residents rather than just the board, explaining the parcel's history, my uncle's original fair faith negotiations, and the board's subsequent pattern of pressure tactics, culminating now in an attempt to force a legal sale rather than negotiate honestly. I mailed that letter directly to every household in the community using publicly available HOA resident contact information. 3 days after residents received that letter, I received an unexpected call, not from Vanessa, but from Patricia, the same resident whose frustrated social media post I discovered weeks earlier during my initial research. I had no idea any of this was actually happening, she said, her voice tight, with genuine anger. We've been blamed for years, told it was complicated legal issues preventing our clubhouse from being finished. Nobody ever mentioned the board was the reason this dragged on for over a decade. I figured residents deserved to know the full story. I said, "You have no idea what you just started," Patricia said. "There's an emergency community meeting being organized for this weekend. People are furious, and it's not directed at you anymore." The emergency community meeting Patricia mentioned happened just 3 days later, and I attended, curious to see exactly how residents would react once they fully understood the situation that had been quietly shaping their unfinished neighborhood for over a decade. The community clubhouse's temporary meeting space, the one small section actually completed years earlier, was packed well beyond capacity, residents standing in doorways and spilling into the parking lot outside. Word had clearly spread fast once my letter reached mailboxes throughout Fairview Commons. Vanessa opened the meeting looking noticeably more exhausted than during our earlier negotiation, clearly having spent the past several days fielding angry calls and messages from residents demanding answers about exactly why their promised community space remained unfinished after 11 years. I understand there's been some confusion, she began carefully, regarding the history of the central parcel and our ongoing efforts to resolve. Confusion? Patricia interrupted, standing up near the front. We were told for years this was some vague, legal complication. Now we find out the actual issue is that this board has spent over a decade trying to lowball a landowner instead of just paying fair value, and now you're trying to force a sale through eminent domain instead of negotiating honestly. The room erupted into overlapping conversations, residents turning toward each other with expressions of disbelief and mounting anger. Vanessa attempted to regain control, but the frustration in that room had clearly been building for years. Finally finding a legitimate target after over a decade of vague, unsatisfying explanations. Robert, the former board member who'd initially warned me, stood up from where he'd been sitting quietly near the back. I served on this board for 6 years, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. I watched this exact pattern happen repeatedly with the original landowner. Lowball offers, refusal to negotiate fairly, followed by attempts to simply wait him out or force his hand legally. This isn't new behavior. It's just finally being seen by the people actually affected by it. Another resident, an older man I didn't recognize, stood up next. I've lived here since the very first phase of construction. We were shown renderings of a completed clubhouse before we ever signed anything. 11 years later, we're still waiting, and apparently it's because our own leadership refused to simply pay a fair price for land they desperately needed. The pressure in that room built steadily until Vanessa, visibly overwhelmed, finally addressed the situation directly. The board will reconsider our approach, she said. We'll present a revised fair offer to the landowner, and we'll formally withdraw the eminent domain petition currently being prepared. The room's tension shifted noticeably at that announcement, though residents remained skeptical, understandably so given 11 years of unfulfilled promises regarding this exact project. I met with Vanessa privately 2 days after that meeting, this time without the careful, controlled presentation of our first negotiation. She looked genuinely exhausted, the confident board president demeanor completely replaced by someone clearly ready to simply resolve this situation as quickly and fairly as possible. I'm prepared to offer the figure you originally requested, she said, sliding a new proposal across the table. Full payment, formalized immediately along with a public statement acknowledging the board's history of mishandling these negotiations. I reviewed the offer carefully alongside Carolyn, who confirmed it genuinely reflected fair market value based on the property's strategic importance and the extensive documentation we'd compiled throughout this entire process. I accepted. The sale finalized within 3 weeks, construction on the long-delayed clubhouse finally resuming almost immediately afterward, funded partly by the sale itself and partly by community dues residents had apparently been paying toward this exact project for over a decade without ever seeing meaningful progress. The clubhouse opened 8 months later, nearly 12 years after Fairview Commons' original promised completion date. I attended the opening ceremony, invited somewhat unexpectedly by Patricia and several other residents who'd become unlikely allies throughout this entire process. Your uncle would probably find this whole thing hilarious, Patricia said, laughing softly as we watched residents finally enjoying the community space they'd been promised over a decade earlier. He probably would. I agreed, thinking about that simple sticky note, 3 words that had apparently protected exactly this kind of leverage for over a decade, waiting patiently for someone to finally understand its full significance. Sometimes the things we inherit without fully understanding turn out to hold more power than we ever expected. And sometimes, refusing to be taken advantage of, even quietly, even for years, eventually forces an entire community to finally confront a truth they'd been kept from for far too long. If this story hit you the way it hit me telling it, make sure you're subscribed, because the next HOA story I bring you might uncover something even more unexpected than a forgotten quarter acre of land.